With me now is Michael Leiter, MSNBC national security analyst and former director of the National Counterterrorism Center, and was involved in planning the operation that killed bin Laden. It's interesting, McRaven doesn't say President Trump in that statement, but he makes it very clear that he respects both political parties and the leaders that come out of him, as long as they uphold the dignity of the office. It seems like there's a notable exception there, and that is Donald Trump.
Well, there's no doubt. I mean, Bill has made his views, as he always did when he was in government, very, very clear. And I think Bill, when he criticizes the president for his attacks on freedom of press, is speaking from his heart and speaking from almost 4 decades, really 4 decades plus of public service, both in the Navy and as chancellor of the University of Texas system. But honestly, the president's criticism for all of us who served with Bill, who know Bill, who saw Bill close up or far away, know that Bill is first and foremost a patriot, a leader, and does not fly a partisan flag in the least.
This is not the first war hero. It's not the first military man that the president has attacked or criticized. I doubt it'll be the last. He started his campaign by going after John McCain. He got 20,000 people to show up for him right after that in Mobile, Alabama. They didn't care. They didn't like McCain, maybe before that, but they didn't like him, period. So when Donald Trump said it, they cheered Donald Trump on. Khizr Khan, whose son died fighting the war on terror. Donald Trump picked him out. A Gold Star family picked him out and trashed him. He doesn't care where you come from in the military, what you've done in the military, how many stars you have, what your title is in the military. If you don't agree with him, he will throw you under the bus. Why is it different now? What happens going forward? Does it matter to those in the military? Are they listening to the president? How do you feel about people who still support the president after that sort of language?
Well, Katie, I think this goes to, since before he was actually sworn in as president, the president's really personal attacks and to some extent his attacks on the professionalism of those in the national security community. And neither the uniformed military nor the intelligence community should ever be free of thoughtful, reasoned criticism. When the military gets something wrong, they should look in and they should try to repair things. When the intelligence community makes mistakes, they should be subject to reasonable, thoughtful criticism. But what the path the president is taking clearly is not that. It is not informed by fact. It's really apparently not informed by a terribly good understanding of how something like the Osama bin Laden raid even occurred. And I think that the ad hominem attacks, the personal attacks, do undermine the ability for the national security community to believe that he has their backs when they do something wrong. And again, it doesn't have to be blind faith and allegiance. The president has a right to criticize the performance, but to do so professionally. And I think he has, since before taking office, broken down the bounds of trust that are so critical between any president and his or her national security establishment.
He's also going after Pakistan. He went after them in the interview with Chris Wallace the other day. He said, we no longer pay Pakistan the billions because they would take our money and do nothing for us. Bin Laden, a prime example, Afghanistan being another. They were just one of the many countries that take from the United States without giving anything in return. He called them fools. Pakistan's prime minister responded, saying Trump's false assertions add insult to the injury Pak has suffered in U.S. war on terror in terms of lives lost and destabilized and economic costs. He needs to be informed about historical facts. Pakistan has suffered enough fighting U.S.'s war. Now we will do what is best for our people and our interests. He's going after one of our allies as well. That being said, bin Laden was found in Abbottabad, just down the road from Pakistan's military academy.
Absolutely. And I think people have forgotten the tension that existed between the U.S. and Pakistan before the bin Laden raid and how bad that relationship got in 2011 when we put a SEAL team in Pakistan and found bin Laden. These were very, very rough years after that with Pakistan at critical times as we surged into Afghanistan. So the president's words are, to some extent, well-informed. Pakistan is a challenging ally. They have been a challenging ally in the war on terror for many, many years. But I would say going back to 2011 and commenting on that serves no useful purpose. We should be tough on Pakistan. We should require things. But trying to relive and refight that battle, those weren't good times then, and I don't think the president should go back to them now.
Do you think he's serving a greater purpose, a larger purpose, in order to get us out of wars, to end wars, to make the world a safer place? Or is this more focused on 2020 and his ability to tell voters in 2020 that he is a great supporter of the military in the same way that he did in 2016?
Katie, I wish that I could attribute some of these comments to a grand political strategy, a vision for the U.S. and the world, or even a political strategy in 2020. Frankly, I don't see that. What I generally see is if someone, whether of the stature of Admiral McRaven or not, criticizes the president, he's against them. And ultimately, what this really does do, as you imply, it pulls away attention from the real issues that face the military, from deployments to the southwest border to veterans issues. It doesn't get to the national security issues we should be discussing. And I think Bill McRaven would very happily take himself out of the conversation if the president focused on those issues instead of these ad hominem attacks.
Michael Leiter. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Katie.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.